This episode includes discussion of suicide, assisted dying, self-harm, and death from philosophical, ethical, and historical perspectives. Some listeners may find these topics difficult. Please listen with care, and if you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm, know that support is available.
Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences. Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Today we welcome our guests Michael Cholbi and Paolo Stellino, who will help us ask the question, how do philosophers talk about suicide? Let's begin by considering three different scenarios. A man all alone, depressed, who spontaneously takes his own life with his handgun. A woman with a painful terminal illness who travels with her family to a foreign country to die under doctor's supervision. And nuclear engineers who voluntarily walk into a power plant on the verge of a meltdown and repair the damage, knowing they'll die within hours from radiation poisoning. All three of these situations describe suicide. In each of them, people knowingly, willingly choose to end their own lives. All are, in some sense, tragedies. But isn't this where the similarities stop? Is suicide the right term for every act of self-annihilation? We certainly talk about each of these stories as if they're about different things. The man who dies by his own gun fills us with anger and shame. We speak of him with whispers and avoid forthrightness in his obituary because his kind of suicide may be contagious, especially amongst young people. The woman who dies with her doctor's assistance certainly makes us sad, but there is also something admirable about what she is doing. Her end fills us with relief. She is out of pain, and her loved ones were given the gift of saying goodbye. And the engineers who repair the nuclear reactor, they're heroes. Their sacrifice is shouted from the rooftops and celebrated in the streets. We call them our protectors, not our failure, even if somewhere along the line we could have saved them by building more reliable reactors. In short, the act of suicide is inseparable from the meaning we place on it. It is contextual, cultural, and malleable. It is intertwined with our ability to anticipate it and the violence that surrounds it. Shooting oneself with a gun is a messy and horrific affair. It soils the place it happened. Physician-assisted suicide is often medicalized, but it can create hallowed ground. There is something tremendously noble about hospice, something spiritual. Death by radiation, that remains comparatively hidden. It's behind hospital doors, controlled by the people in power. The blistering and bodily degradation are not recorded by reporters. The masses only hear the narrative. They don't see the images. Over and over again, we are protected from the ugly sacrifice of heroism. This is why we can still romanticize war. On today's episode, we're going to look at suicide through the eyes of philosophers, focusing on our guest's impressive anthology, documenting just about every approach to the subject. We'll use it to talk about the countless writings that record thousands of years of reflections on the subject, asking, for example, whether there is dignity in certain kinds of death or if giving up is always a betrayal. We'll highlight the tensions between religion and political theory. Do we have a right to die, or are we forbidden to destroy God's property? We'll also try to find a satisfying definition of suicide and the myriad ways modern culture portrays it, all while being analytical and thoughtful in the face of an emotionally fraught subject. We need to manage our fear. There is something about suicide that makes us wary of engaging with it directly. For some listeners, talking dispassionately about it may feel like a violation, like wallowing in the worst experiences we've ever had. Yet this kind of thing is precisely what philosophy does best. It is a method for engaging the human intellect, not to disregard feelings, but to understand them, explain them, value them. Tackling any subject philosophically is a sign of respect. Not talking about things is how philosophers communicate disdain. One of my favorite movies, Harold and Maude, tells the story of a 20-year-old man who falls in love with a 79-year-old woman. The film plays the romance for laughs and political satire until Harold discovers that Maude, a Holocaust survivor, plans to kill herself on her 80th birthday. We see the numbers tattooed on her arm. We hear her talk about her lost love who died in the camps. We watch as she symbolically lives in a repurposed train car. When Harold learns of her planned suicide, he is horrified and feels betrayed, and he tries to save her. The movie wants us to ask if he is right to try. My students don't get the film. They can't get past the age gap relationship and the image of Harold and Maude in bed. Most of them are too young to fully grasp the main point of the film, that the ultimate rebuff to the Nazis who hope to slaughter Maude is for her to control her own mortality. The Germans don't get to decide when her life ends, Maude insists. She does. She is a nonconformist in life and she is a nonconformist in death. Her moral authority is found in her insisting upon her own agency. Only she and no one else gets to decide when her story is over. It is a deeply powerful film and a wonderful celebration of eccentricity, adventure, and love in the face of a brutal world that imposes evil upon us. I'm telling you about it because it poses one more question that I hope we can ask together. Is it ever possible for suicide to be beautiful? Not moral, that's a different question, but beautiful. A celebration of the largeness of the human spirit in all of its creativity. It may seem odd to think about the destruction of death as a creative act, but for Maude it was. Was she right or wrong about this? Maybe on today's show, we'll find out. And now our guests. Michael Cholbi is professor and personal chair at philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. He has published widely in ethical theory, practical ethics, and the philosophy of death and dying. Paolo Stellino is an appointed research fellow at the Nova University of Lisbon Institute of Philosophy and an invited professor in their Department of Philosophy. His main areas of interest are the history of philosophy and the philosophy of film and ethics. Together, they've edited the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Suicide, published last year by Oxford University Press. Michael, Paolo, welcome to Why.
Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Jack, for the invitation.
To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Why Radio Show, WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that others can find the show and listen to all 18 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, whyradioshow.org. And as always, this show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions, so click Donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. So, Michael, Paolo, when I first got the book, I was a little taken aback by how much information is in it. I've had some conversations about the consequences and morality of suicide, but I don't think I was aware of just how many threads there are to pull. How would you recommend someone begins such a tough and often intimate inquiry? How do we think philosophically about suicide without being burdened by tragedy and fear?
I'm happy to tackle that one first, Jack. I certainly agree that it's a topic that can evoke strong emotions in people. Many people will have had some firsthand experience. Perhaps they've engaged in suicidal behavior themselves, or someone close to them has, or perhaps even died due to suicide. So it does present challenges, I think, in terms of trying to achieve that arm's length relationship to it that we need in order to think philosophically about it. But I do think that what we can do is we can try to figure out how to puzzle ourselves or find some grounds for wondering about suicide. And I think that can help us put us in the right frame of mind to think about the topic. So in my own case, what I have found most puzzling, or at least what has been most provocative in my mind, is to notice that there's a deep asymmetry to human existence. We exist not by our own hand, not due to our own choices. None of us are here because we chose to be. Someone else chose for us to exist. And that struck me when I first thought about it as surprising. I didn't really have a say in whether or not I exist. Should I have a say in whether I don't exist, or at least whether I should have the option of deciding not to exist any further? And that was, for me at least, the beginning of noticing that there are some real philosophical perplexities around suicide.
This idea that we don't have control, it strikes me that there's a choice then. We can decide that our life is a gift given by someone else, or we can decide that our life is an obligation imposed by someone else. Do those two interpretations lead necessarily to competing attitudes about suicide?
The gift argument is obviously a religious argument. The idea is that God gave our life as a gift to us, and it would be a sin to refuse this gift by committing suicide. For instance, Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica says that the decision to depart from the earthly life, or the passage from the earthly life to the afterlife, is not something that is subject to man's free will. So only God has the power to decide whether we can depart from this life. And this is obviously a religious point of view. So if you are not religious, then maybe this argument does not hold for you. Although there is also a secular version of this argument, which is known as the sanctity of life argument, meaning that basically life has an absolute or inherent value. So once again, we're not allowed to take leave from life. So this is one of the probably most powerful arguments, especially for religious people, although, as I said, there's also a non-religious, a secular version of the argument.
You set up a really interesting puzzle, and I know that you personally work on Nietzsche, and there are all sorts of threads in existentialism. And so the first thing that popped into my head when you talked about Augustine and you said that Augustine argues you can't make this decision, but of course you can make the decision, but you ought not, you should not. And so is the meaningless or meaningfulness of life also essential to the discussion? The existentialists will talk about absurdity and absolute freedom, and if you take one strand of it, we create the meaning in our life, whereas the religious traditions were operating on something independent. Is this really about the meaning and meaninglessness of life, or is it more about acquiescing to authority, being subordinate to the powers that be? How much of this dichotomy is about institutions and authority and power, and how much of it is about freedom and the value we place on the experience of every day?
I would say that we should think of suicide as the exemplification of human freedom. In some sense, it's the ultimate option we have to decide that we no longer wish to exist. And I think there are some good arguments in defense of, for example, the legalization of assisted dying that appeal to the idea that we should be free to decide the duration of our lives, at least under certain circumstances. The question of the way you posed it, Jack, of meaningfulness of life versus acquiescing to authority, I suppose I'm skeptical that there is any being that have the right to claim authority over our existence aside from ourselves. Who better than ourselves to judge whether our lives should continue? The thought that we owe gratitude to someone, whether it's God and so forth, for bringing us into existence, I guess I find myself very skeptical of that thought. Some people's lives don't seem like a very well-chosen gift. Their lives have a great deal of suffering and hardship in them. And even if those lives are a gift to them, it seems to me it's not necessarily a kind of insult to those who have brought us into existence, whether it's God or our parents or our society, to decide at some point that the gift has become not very useful to us. It's become more of a burden than a benefit.
How much of this depends on our ability to be objective and rational and hold our own lives in perspective? Because, of course, many people have either had the experience or know of the experience of talking to someone who is incredibly distraught, maybe in terrible pain, and saying, my life isn't worth living. And the response to that is, you think that now, but in 6 months, you'll feel differently. You lost your spouse, you'll find someone else. You are in pain now, but the medication will work. When we talk about people deciding to kill themselves, how much are we working with an ideal of a human being who can make inherently good, authentic decisions, and someone who is distorted by circumstance and can't really see themselves and their situation accurately?
This is a very interesting question, Jack, and this allows me to point out what I think is the main dichotomy in the philosophy of suicide. What I mean by this is that in ancient philosophy, in many philosophical schools, we have the idea of the sage man who is able to make a very thoughtful and rational decision when the time has come and commit suicide. So this is the philosophical suicide, which is, I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's a bit idealistic, I would say. On the other hand, you have the idea, or maybe also the stereotype, that suicide is always or almost always committed because of mental illness, for instance. And therefore, the choice of committing suicide would not be free, would not be rational. So these are, for me, two extremes, and it is very important to, I would say, navigate through or in between these two extremes. So it's also very important for us philosophers that we fight against this idea, against this extreme pathologizing or pathologization or medicalization of suicide. I'm not saying with this that mental illness sometimes or oftentimes plays a very important role, but we think it's important here that we revindicate the role of autonomy, of freedom of the individual.
I want to point out to our listeners just for a second, because this is one of my favorite things, that we haven't been talking very long, and already we are talking about the existence of God, the meaning of life, the ideal human being, the models of what it means to be wise and judgmental. It all comes at us so fast. And this is part of what makes the topic so difficult. And I'm going to pull all of those threads in a little bit, but I want to step back as a renewed starting point, because, Michael, you did something in passing in your previous answer where you used the phrase assisted dying instead of assisted suicide. How important is the language that we use? I know right now, at least popularly in the United States, people want to say died by suicide instead of committed suicide because it has less stigma. And obviously, suicide itself is a laden term. How important are the words we use, and how much does the terminology define the direction of the argument and the nature of the conclusions that we come to?
I'll admit to being a bit frustrated about debates that occur both in the popular domain, but sometimes within philosophy as well, that basically seem to me to get bogged down in, terminological disputes. Are we going to describe a certain action as, suicide or not, and so forth. I think it's worth keeping in mind that suicide is always a politically contested phenomenon, right? So consider that the founding hero of Western philosophy, Socrates, was condemned to die, arguably made to engage in suicide. And I think that exemplifies how suicide can never be approached in a way that's completely apolitical. And a lot of times what we see in political debates are people trying to contest the language that we use to describe the phenomena that they're disputing. So I, as you noted, used the phrase assisted dying in my earlier response. I do that in no small part because that's the term that has come be popular within these debates, even though I'm happy to say, in the way that I think you were suggesting early on with your three examples, Jack, that this is in fact suicide. It should be thought of as suicide. Assisted dying is a decision in which a person voluntarily decides that they are going to die earlier than they would otherwise have died. And that seems to me to be sufficient to count their death as a death due to suicide. The reason, of course, that terms like assisted dying have become prominent and why advocacy groups tend not to use the language of suicide or assisted suicide is because it tends to evoke strong negative emotional reactions in some people. Even though I think that it's accurate to describe assisted dying as physician-assisted suicide, it's not proven to be politically salutary to use that language.
May I add something, Jack?
Yes, please. And I was going to ask you very specifically, Paolo,
Okay.
but is this the case in other languages? You're in Portugal now. I'm assuming from your name that you're Italian ethnically. Mm-hmm. Portuguese, Italian, other languages, does it have the same kind of tensions and rhetoric that English struggles with?
Yeah, Italian, Portuguese, and French, and even Spanish use the word suicide. So suicide in French, suicidio in Portuguese, and suicidio in Italian. I think the German here is very interesting because the word that has been used during many centuries was Selbstmord, which literally means self-murder. Now, the word that is being used is rather Selbsttötung, which means self-killing, or Freitod, which means frei death. But the interesting point here for me is that is the etymology of suicide, which is so sui, the prefix means oneself, and then caedere means to kill. It's so literally suicide is self-killing, but it's been interpreted as a self-murder. So the point here for me is the strongly negative connotation that is associated to the term. So going back to your question to Michael, I don't know whether changing the terminology really solved the problem, and by the problem means the negative connotation that is associated to suicide. I think that's the real problem for me. I completely agree with Michael.
We're going to come back to this question after our break. I'm going to ask you about the definition of suicide, but also in anticipation, I want to ask you about the universality of the discussion. But for the moment, you are listening to Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein talking with Michael Cholbi and Paolo Stellino, and we'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
We are back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We're talking with Michael Cholbi and Paolo Stellino about the philosophy of suicide in honor of their anthology describing all of the many issues. And I guess I promised before the break that I would ask about the definition of suicide. But even before that, so much of our political conversations revolve around the notions of East and West. I notice in the anthology there's Asian traditions of suicide as distinct from Christian traditions as distinct from Islamic traditions. Is there a universal conversation about suicide, or is there distinct cultural differences, and how much are they identifiable in terms of the way that right now in the current world, we tend to divide the world in terms of East and West and Christian and Jewish and Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist, et cetera, et cetera. Does the debate about suicide map with our global political understanding of the tensions around the world?
What I think you see when, for example, you look at polling on medically assisted dying, suicide issues like this, when you look at polling that's conducted in different nations throughout the world, of course there's trends or overall patterns in that data. Unsurprisingly, nations in Northern Europe tend to be more supportive of a right to die, more supportive of a right to assisted dying than, say, largely Christian nations in, say, sub-Saharan Africa. But what you do notice is that no matter the society we're talking about, there's a variation of opinion, right? I think that there is probably no community where there's a uniformity of opinion about the morality of suicide, whether it's wrong, whether it can ever violate duties to others, whether it can be rational, whether it should be legally permitted or socially sanctioned. So, though I don't think that there is a kind of global conversation about suicide, I think there are lots of local conversations about suicide that are going on, and what within them is some measure of disagreement. Again, not necessarily disagreement that takes exactly the same form or character throughout different parts of the world, but disagreement nevertheless.
I want to ask what the definition of suicide might be. But I'm also curious as to how much that answer will be working from a conclusion. And what I mean by that is the following. I was talking with my wife on the way down to the studio, and she brought up kamikaze pilots. And the comparison was very stark for me that we use the term kamikaze pilots to talk about World War II, but when we talk about September 11th, we use suicide bombers. And the language of suicide is so intertwined with enemy, loyalty, value, honor. Can we create a definition of suicide that isn't already a reflection of the politics and the morality underlying the issue?
I think, Jack, you tackled a very important point. The problem, once again, with our definition of suicide, or the way in which we think about suicide, is that we, in general, or usually, we tend to associate a very strongly negative connotation to the term. And if we want to discuss from a philosophical point of view about suicide, we ideally want to avoid this. So this is one point that Michael points out in his book, in his 2011 book, Suicide, The Philosophical Dimension. So whenever we try to find a definition of suicide, ideally this definition should be descriptive and not value-laden, especially because, as I said, the word carries with it a strongly negative connotation. The other question, maybe this can be another question, but the other question is why the word carries with it a negative connotation. And there are very specific historical reasons. Maybe we can also talk about this later, but I don't know if Michael wants to add something to this.
Yes, please, Michael.
Paolo's certainly right that if we're trying to make some philosophical headway on this topic, we're likely to talk at cross purposes if we're using morally laden or value laden definitions of suicide, because if one party thinks of suicide as inherently morally objectionable and the other doesn't, it's very difficult for them to speak about the phenomena in ways that don't just beg the questions against one another. Going back again to the rhetoric around physician-assisted suicide, again, I think one of the reasons that advocacy groups generally shy away from talking about what they favor as assisted suicide is, again, this negative connotation that Paolo was referencing. I think the standard starting point for philosophical and legal thinking about just what suicide is, how to define it, is to say it's something like intentional self-killing. So it's not simply acting so as to cause one's death, but acting, if you will, with the aim of bringing about one's own death. That seems to account for a lot of the typical cases that we would think of as suicide, or kind of paradigmatic cases. It would cover, I think, at least a couple of the examples that you gave at the beginning of our conversation today, Jack. Maybe the third example of the nuclear engineers is a little bit hazier exactly what that definition implies. But it seems to me it's a good starting point for the conversation. I would only add that one of the things that I think is not a good starting point for the conversation about how to define suicide is to talk about it in terms of choosing death. One of the things I think we should keep in mind is that we human beings are mortal. We are going to die at some point. There's not really, I think, any sense in talking about us choosing or not choosing death because it's going to happen to all of us eventually. I think a more helpful starting point then is to think about suicide in terms of choosing to die earlier rather than later. It's a choice not so much about whether to die, but when or how or under what circumstances to die.
How time-bound is this definition? Sometimes you hear people referring to things like alcoholism as slow suicide, or doing self-destructive acts that are destined to terminate our life prematurely, bad behaviors that are habitual. Is it a category mistake to use the language of suicide to talk about behaviors that may hasten death or our deterioration, but are not explicitly, absolutely 100% devoted to a singular task of ending our own life?
I think we can bring about our own deaths intentionally, slowly, right? There's no reason to think that, for example, I couldn't take a very slow-acting poison. And I'm thinking really slow-acting. Maybe it would cause my death over 12 months or 12 years. If I take such a medication and my aim is to bring about my own death earlier than I would otherwise anticipate it occurring, I think I've engaged in suicide. That seems right to me. I think the crucial thing, and this goes back to the bit I was referencing a moment ago when I was talking about the role of intention in suicide, is that I think suicide has to involve, in some way or other, the individual endorsing their death. So the person who is drinking themselves to death, to use that common phrase, doesn't usually endorse their own death. That is to say, they're not drinking so as to hasten their own deaths. They may well foresee that they are going to die, or they're increasing the risk that they will die as a result, but they're not endorsing it. They would think of it as a success, so to speak, if they could manage to continue with their alcoholism but not die as a consequence. So I think that there's an important aspect of this that has to involve the idea that the suicidal person is endorsing their own death, intending it in some sense. This will leave some interesting borderline cases where it may be a little bit difficult to know exactly what to say. So one example of this, I think, is the individual who engages in a politically motivated hunger strike. Are they merely hoping to bring attention to their cause through not consuming food and thereby increasing the chance that they'll die of starvation? Or is there a point at which we might say that they're really willing to die? And if they do happen to die as a consequence of their hunger strike, they will have died due to suicide.
That notion of suicide as protest was in my head as you were answering the question, so I'm glad you bring it up. This goes back to Paolo's concern that definitions not automatically presume negative connotations or negative moral values. How much does sacrifice mitigate the suicidal example? The hunger strike, the monk who sets himself on fire, even the soldier who jumps on a grenade to save the platoon. That sacrifice is what we tend to focus on rather than the suicide. Are these two notions, sacrifice and suicide, are they always in tension? Can they be partners? Is it more about emotionally mitigating the problem? How much does suicide presume that the death is a waste, that it shouldn't have happened, that we shouldn't have set the circumstances to happen, that there's an alternative universe where it didn't need to happen? How much does suicide have to be a loss rather than a win?
There are several aspects to this question. So the way I see the problem is that there's this negative connotation associated to suicide. Now, when it comes to protest suicide, for instance, we tend to see this kind of suicide as altruistic suicide, as altruistic behavior. So I think you're really right when you say that this emotionally mitigates the problem. So probably many people are more willing to accept suicide when it is an altruistic suicide, an unselfish suicide. The most famous example is probably the Buddhist monk who self-immolated himself in Vietnam in the 60s. But recently we also have the example of I think his name was Mohammed Bouazizi, if I recall correctly, Tunisian street vendor who self-immolating during the Arab Spring in 2010. So I think in these cases, those who are against suicide at least, tend to see suicide in a more favorable light, because this kind of suicide are considered as altruistic suicides. We also have other problems. We still have the problem of how to combine this kind of suicide with the self-respect we owe to ourselves, for instance, or how rational is to expect that my death by or through self-immolation, for instance, will lead to a meaningful social or political change. But so these are complexities that are linked to suicide as conceived as a political protest, or as the other example of the nuclear engineer that you mentioned.
I think Paolo's definitely on the right track with his remarks. I think there's a tendency to associate the term suicide with self-killings that people view as selfish, as oriented toward the relief of a person's suffering, whereas suicides that are altruistic, that seem to be aimed at sacrifices for the greater good, are not thought of as suicide. And that's a kind of attempt to, I suppose, give them a kind of better moral sheen by not associating them with this negative term. And I guess I've always felt that this says something quite profound about what it is that really bothers us or upsets us about suicide. We talk quite a lot about whether or not a suicidal person is making a rational choice, whether it's prudent for them to hasten their own deaths. But I suspect that a lot of what makes us nervous or causes us to be unsettled by suicide is the sense that the suicidal person is rejecting us, right, is deciding to leave this world that we share with them. And this is a perhaps worrying commentary on that world or on our willingness to accept the world as it is. So when we look upon someone's suicide as altruistic, they seem not to be rejecting us or rejecting the conditions of the world. They are trying to sustain those conditions or make the world a more desirable place. Whereas the selfish suicide seems to be saying to us, this is a good party. I was unhappy to have received this invitation and now I'm going to leave. And that, I think, is a worrying message in some people's minds.
That is a fascinating and really important point. This idea that part of our reaction to suicide is, my father didn't love me enough to stay and fight it out. Therefore, his suicide is my rejection. These people who are doing this self-killing, they're not considering the rest of our feelings. How hard is it to have a conversation about suicide that is about the person who is self-killing as opposed to the survivors and the other people? Humanity has a problem with narcissism, right? It's very hard for us, as a general rule, to consider it about other people as opposed to about us, although obviously there's cultural variation in that. Have you found that in the literature, in the discussion, that there is a genuine difficulty in focusing on the agent of the suicide, and that there's just guilt and grief and anger, and that it's the survivors that are going to define the moral value of the act?
I was going to mention guilt, Jack, so I'm glad you mentioned it. Just to complete what Michael was saying, I also find really interesting what Michael said, And I think there's also a strong component of guilt associated with suicide, meaning the feeling that we as suicide survivors, we feel that probably we didn't do enough to, let's say, prevent the suicide or help our friend or our relatives or family members, whatever. So there's also this strong feeling of guilt, which is associated with suicide and which is probably not associated with altruistic or unselfish suicide, going back to the previous example.
Let me phrase the question slightly differently, because you've both talked about not imposing this negative sheen on it. Is suicide inherently neutral? Is it like tofu? Does it take the flavor that's in the container? Is it that suicide is just an act? It is neither good nor bad inherently. It is entirely about the context and the consequences. And so the debate is not about the act itself, but how we are framing the debate, the narrative around the debate, the causes and the consequences of the debate. Can we treat suicide as just inherently neutral, and therefore the act itself is only judged by the circumstances around it?
Okay, this is a very complex question, Jack. I think this is also depend from the moral perspective from which you're judging. I guess a Nietzschean perspective will be completely different from a Kantian perspective. In a nutshell, my answer would be suicide is never neutral, I would say. The point I was trying to make before is that if we want to discuss about it from a philosophical point of view, then we should find a neutral. If this is possible, this is also another question. I'm not sure this is possible, but anyway, we need to find a kind of neutral and by this descriptive definition of suicide. But whether suicide is inherently neutral, of course, you can describe and analyze the act from an empirical point of view, for instance, but I think that emotions would always be there. So it's very hard, even if it's not a suicide, that even if we don't have a direct relation to the suicide that has been committed, I think it's really difficult to discuss about suicide from a neutral point of view.
Well, I would say, absolutism on either side of the spectrum is probably not a very sensible position. And by absolutism, I mean the views that say that suicide is always necessarily immoral or always necessarily irrational or imprudent, or conversely, that it's always morally innocuous or honorable or rational. It seems to me very clear that suicide's like almost any phenomenon, right? It's going to come in quite a variety of different profiles. Sometimes it will be morally defensible, sometimes it will be rational, sometimes it won't be. And that, I think, should not strike us as at all a surprising conclusion. I think it's absolutely understandable that we feel hurt or rejected by people's suicides. After all, they're deciding to leave the world that we share with them. And I think it's compassionate of us to look upon those whose family members or friends have died due to suicide to treat them with great sympathy. That said, I think at the same time, we should ask the hard questions about whether or not our reactions to suicide have something to do sometimes with the stigma that surrounds it and perhaps misconceptions about why it is that people engage in this. So, you think about the classic example of suicide from the history of philosophy, that of Socrates. I think almost everyone who looks upon Socrates' death, and he did have a chance to extricate himself from this, we should remind ourselves. He was compelled to engage in suicide, but he could have opted for exile. But when we look upon that suicide, I don't think that we should expect that his followers and friends and so forth felt a great deal of rejection or abandonment or anything like that, precisely because the process was open. They understood what he was doing. They understood his presumptive reasons for doing it. And I think that were it the case that suicide was perhaps less stigmatized treated in a less secretive or almost clandestine sort of way, I wonder if some of that pain or feeling of a hurt or abandonment that people feel when those that they care about die due to suicide, whether some of that wouldn't abate.
So just for our listeners who aren't up on their Platonic dialogues, Socrates was found guilty of several things, including corrupting the youth. He was put in prison and given the death sentence. His friends were given the opportunity to help him escape, but he refused, saying that he had received all the attention and the education of the city of Athens, and therefore he should take his punishment. And Plato gives us an account of Socrates' death scene where he drinks hemlock himself and he experiences the numbing of his body from his feet upward so that his mind and his consciousness is the last part to leave us so that he can continue having philosophical conversations. And Socrates is the ideal and the patron saint and the symbol of philosophy in many ways. And so to talk about it in terms of punishment, in terms of freedom, in terms of suicide, in terms of the freedom of the mind, that's a super rich and interesting conversation. The point that you're both making and the point that Paolo made specifically is that there is a difference between talking about suicide philosophically, engaging in it analytically, and the experience of suicide. And of course, we're not going to react neutrally to the experience of suicide, but we want this philosophical, anthropological, intellectual perspective where we approach it neutrally. Philosophy is often divided by two different modes, the descriptive and the prescriptive. Philosophy is descriptive when it describes how the world is. There is a God, there is a meaning of life, everything is made up of atoms. And it's prescriptive in that it can tell us what we ought to do. This should happen. This is what justice is and how we should organize the society. It is immoral to kill yourself or whatever. I know that the debate about suicide philosophically is going to have descriptive and prescriptive elements. What are the central questions in the descriptive aspect of philosophy of suicide, and what are the central questions in the prescriptive? What are the themes that we talk about when we're trying to describe suicide as a fact of life? And what are the themes that we talk about when we're making recommendations about the good life and virtue and moral responsibility and flourishing?
I would say that the first important point, distinction to make here is between philosophy of suicide and suicidology. So suicidology can be defined as the, let's say, scientific study of suicidal behavior, the cause of suicidality, and suicide prevention. So it is more related to disciplines like sociology or psychiatry, whereas philosophy of suicide typically asks philosophical questions such as, is suicide morally permissible? Is it rational? Is aiding others to commit suicide morally permissible, or let's say even required in some circumstances? According to this distinction, in my opinion, I would say that philosophy of suicide has more to do with the prescriptive side of the problem, whereas ideology has more to do with the descriptive side of it. But I don't know whether there's a descriptive side of philosophy of suicide.
I suppose you can view the question of how to define suicide as a descriptive question in, broadly speaking, moral or practical psychology. But I think Paolo's right that philosophers, when they've turned their attention to suicide, have usually been interested in these prescriptive or normative questions about whether hasting one's death could be rational, whether we have a moral obligation not to do it, or perhaps even a moral obligation to do it under certain extraordinary circumstances. So I think that's a useful contrast in terms of thinking about what the particular province of philosophy of suicide is. That said, when you begin thinking about what kinds of ethical conclusions we should draw about, let's say, a physician-assisted dying, invariably you have to talk about empirical questions. You have to talk about the frequency with which individual suicidality seems to be due to mental illness. You have to talk about the ways in which the person who's seeking physician-assisted dying is looking for the help of a medical professional and whether that's consistent with medical codes of ethics or medical values. So even though the heart, I would say, of philosophy of suicide is, yes, indeed, prescriptive or normative, invariably, when you get into the weeds of thinking about suicide in the real world, philosophers have to be attentive to empirical realities too.
How relevant is standpoint epistemology in the discussion of suicide? And for our listeners, what that means is there is a school of thought that argues that being marginalized, being oppressed, being the experiencer of a certain kind of suffering and injustice gives people a special and particularly helpful perspective on the questions of justice and immorality, that if you are a woman in a patriarchal society, you understand things that men don't. If you are incredibly poor in a society that doesn't support your needs, that will teach you something about the world very important that we should attend to and give maybe priority to, as opposed to the wealthy people. Is there a sense in the discussion of the philosophy of suicide that the marginalized, the people who have experienced it, either failed suicide or watched someone go through it, are the victims of injustice given a kind of priority in the discussion in the way that they are in contemporary political philosophy, particularly discussions of liberalism and justice? How much does standpoint epistemology inform the debate?
So I have not encountered philosophers writing on suicide specifically invoking standpoint epistemology, but I do think you sometimes hear philosophers express sentiments akin to those that you were articulating when they emphasize the importance of trying to understand the point of view of the suicidal person. I think some philosophers are sympathetic to the notion that suicide could be rational, morally permissible, in part because they think that the belief that it is, say, inherently irrational or it's unethical fails to take account of the reality of the suicidal mind, of what it really is to feel like one wants to bring one's life to an end. And I think it's vitally important in this debate that perspective be taken seriously. And I think there is some reason to think that the perspective of suicidal people has sometimes not been taken seriously in philosophical debates, and honestly not taken all that seriously by people in other academic disciplines or in clinical practices. I think we do need to listen to persons who have suicidal ideation, suicidal history, to try to understand what it is that they're undergoing and why they might have seen or do see ending their lives as a viable option. There have been some philosophers who've put some emphasis on the idea that being suicidal, engaging in suicidal thinking, has been a kind of rationale for discrimination, for oppression even. And I think that's a point of view that definitely deserves to be heard out in this conversation.
The point of view that considers gender. We have an interesting chapter on gender in the ontology. I'm not saying, obviously, that women are marginalized, but it's very interesting to reflect on the way in which the discussion, let's say more the public discussion is about suicide is often conceived in binary terms. So masculine, what is more masculine, what is more feminine in relation to suicide. So for instance, more men than women die by suicide, whereas more women than men attempt suicide. So there's often this idea that only men are truly capable of serious suicidal action. Why? Because men are strong, whereas there's this idea that women are more passive. So there's the idea of women committing suicide because of love or relationships or more emotional reasons, whereas in reality, if you have a look to the statistics, many women that commit suicide because of sexual and emotional abuse or neglect or economic hardship. So it is very important that we, even in this case, that we go over prejudices and stereotypes related to suicide.
It's very important, I think, to recognize that all of the fault lines that are going to inform positive and negative experiences of being a person in society are going to inform suicide. And insofar as we marginalize and treat women in a certain way, obviously it's going to affect that. I have two more questions that I want to ask. I guess the first question, and let me ask it in terms of the prescriptive elements. Physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, suicide tourism, going to another country and arranging for this. Is that a specific and boundaried case that is completely distinct from the person who is depressed in the problem that I set up in the beginning, which is if they're both suicide, they're very different kinds of suicide. But also, in terms of prescription, how much is it the job of the philosopher to persuade people that suicide tourism, for example, is moral or isn't moral? How distinct is that case, and what is the role of the philosopher in analyzing that case? Is the conversation intended to move public and political opinion towards a certain conclusion?
So in my opinion, the goal of philosophers working philosophy of suicide is twofold. On the one hand is to discuss arguments about the morality of suicide or the rationality of suicide or other relevant philosophical problems. So this is certainly one main goal for me. The other goal is to generate public discussion. What I mean by this is that there is a refusal of death in Western culture. I will limit myself to Western culture, but there certainly is a refusal of facing death, especially with the new evolution of social media and all the filters we have on Instagram, on Facebook, whatever. So the idea here is to, once again, to hide aging, not to face death. And I think we have the same problem with the suicide. So suicide is, because of the stigma that are associated with suicide, is a taboo. And I think our goal as philosophers is to generate public discussion. And I'm also saying this because, and there's a link with suicide tourism. In Italy, as we're close to Switzerland, and in Italy, most of the people seeking physician-assisted suicide need to travel to Switzerland. Why? Because in Italy, we don't have legislation. So you may be in favor or against suicide, but the most important thing is to generate public discussion around suicide. The worst thing we can do is to hide the problem, which is a very relevant problem. So either you're in favor of suicide prevention, or you think that in certain circumstances suicide is morally allowed. The most important thing, I repeat, is to generate discussion. And I think this is one of the most important goals that we as philosophers have.
Agree with that completely, for what it's worth. I think there's a mindset out there that I've encountered often, which basically amounts to thinking that any conversation around suicide amounts to endorsement, right? That if we ignore the phenomenon, it'll go away. And I think that's just farcical, right? We know that suicide takes place in every community in the world. Hoping that we can stop it by suppressing conversation around suicide, I think, is just completely misguided. We, of course, want to make sure that conversation is directed at the right audiences who have the right kind of maturity and so forth to think about these issues. I think that's been a good development, for example, for news media throughout the world to refrain now from reporting on the details of the suicides of celebrities and public figures. I think that's a sagacious and just policy. But we're certainly not doing suicidal people any favors if we think that we can just kind of, ignore the phenomenon and expect it to disappear.
The final question I want to ask is about pop culture, but it's a version of a question that I ask a lot on this show with folks with very controversial issues. Came up, the last episode was on addiction. It comes up a lot. There's a very interesting documentary called The Bridge, which follows suicides off of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and interviews people who jumped and survived. And in many instances, in I think all the instances in the film, people said the second they jumped, they regretted it and they wish they hadn't done it. The question that I have is it possible to have this conversation and talk about the reality of suicide without it being exploitative or pornographic? So much of our conversations about suicide, so much our visions and discussions of suicide on TV and movies and on social networks, it's for entertainment, it's for shock, it's for guilt and manipulation. Do you think philosophy successfully finds that space to talk about the trauma and the victimization and all this stuff without being exploitative and pornographic? And if it does do that, how does it do that? And is that something that we can export from the philosophical method into the general conversation?
The Bridge is one of the films was made by Eric Steele, if I remember correctly. And it's a documentary film, and it generated a heated debate at the time it was released. And I remember there's one tracking shot in the documentary, meaning the camera following the man who is jumping from the bridge and is committing suicide. So once again, this is a very complex problem, but what I always tell to my student is that the problem is not so much about the content, but about the form in which the content is represented. I will just make an example. I can make a lot of examples here, but I will just make two examples. So if you take, I don't know if you're familiar with Miss Violence. It's a Greek film by Alexander Avranas. And you have the opening scene with the suicide. And what's the problem with this opening scene? Well, the problem is that suicide is aestheticized. So the filmmaker in filming this scene, it's not a documentary film, it's a fiction movie, but the way in which the filmmaker is composing the shot, you can clearly see that he's paying attention to the aesthetics. Whereas if you take another film, Mouchette, it's a art house film by Robert Bresson, who is for me one of the greatest filmmaker ever. The film ends with the suicide of the main character, who is a young lady, and the suicide is left out of the shot. So if you compare these two sequences, you can clearly see that the sensibility of the filmmaker is completely different. So what you were saying, being pornographic, it's very relevant. And this is why, by the way, I wasn't able to watch 13 Reasons Why, because of the, I would say, even pornographic way in which violence and suicide was depicted. So it's a very important issue for me.
I would add that there is definitely a temptation on the part of filmmakers, people creating any medium, to glamorize or romanticize suicide. I mean, there's certainly a way in which the suicidal person makes for a kind of, compelling protagonist or a compelling character in some wider narrative. I don't think we should, preclude all artistic representations of suicide, but I think we do want to be careful about presenting it in a way that is sort of inattentive to the wider context and thereby makes it out to be, a glamorous or romantic act. Jack, you began our conversation early in the hour by asking whether, suicide could ever be beautiful. That's certainly a provocative question. I guess to me, an example where I would say that suicide is depicted in a way that is not exploitative or lurid, but is beautiful, was from the television series The Good Place. Some of your audience may have seen the series, but in the series, the group of characters are immortal, in effect. They can live, as long as they wish to. But at a certain point, several of the characters in the series decide that they've lived as long as they need to. They've lived as long as they need to feel satisfied that their lives have been meaningful and purposeful and worthwhile. And they decide to cross this barrier and, in their lives. And I think it's a fairly moving depiction of suicide at the right time for the right kinds of reasons, to, paraphrase Aristotle. But of course, that's it's a fictional tale, and in reality, deciding that one's life should come to an end is probably going to be a bit more harrowing or complicated than it was for the characters in The Good Place. But I do think that represents an example where suicide is represented as beautiful, and it may well have been beautiful or would have been beautiful.
What Michael said just reminded me of a case that happened about 14 years ago, or 13 anyway, in Paris. French couple. They were really old, probably. They were 85 years old. They checked into a hotel and committed suicide there. So they basically chose the same hotel where they had met 50 years before. And they just didn't want to be separated or to face physical degradation. So I guess suicide is oftentimes very ugly, but it can also be romantic. So I agree with Michael on this.
These are really wonderful examples to end with, both because they tie up the loose ends of the conversation, but also because they are so gripping and really trigger our imagination in a way that wants us to learn more. The Handbook of Philosophy of Suicide that the two of you have created, it's 35 essays, all of reasonable length that pretty much anyone can follow. So folks who are interested can find a topic that they are fascinated by and can read it on their own. But I do think that it is a book that really thrives off of conversation, that the ability to read this, reflect on it, and talk about others will really bring out the quality and the nuance and the power of the conversation. So Michael and Paolo, thank you so much for joining us on Why.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
It was a terrific conversation.
You have been listening to Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We were talking with Michael Cholbi and Paolo Stellino about the philosophy of suicide, and I'll be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyinpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We just completed a conversation with Michael Cholbi and Paolo Stellino about their new Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Suicide. Now, I don't think that my mind was changed on any particular issue from this conversation, and I did not feel that Michael and Paolo were pushing me in a certain way to have a moral opinion. I do think they were respectful of my and other people's experiences, and I think that's tremendously valuable. What I walked away from the conversation with is a sense of how to think about suicide, of the different paths and different concerns that I can focus on to help me reflect in a more disciplined manner. Right? The anthology has lots of chapters on specific philosophers, on suicide. So if you're interested in Kant, or you're interested in Christianity or Augustine, you can read that. But there are also these questions about definition, about tourism, about gender, about grief. We really didn't talk about grief, that allow us to focus our thoughts, because the hardest thing about such a controversial and intimate topic is getting ourselves in a position where we can reflect in a disciplined way so that we can understand our own pre-existing beliefs and communicate them to others and have a constructive conversation rather than a destructive conversation. And that's what the philosophy of suicide is designed to do. It's designed to take a zillion different perspectives and a zillion different filters and organize them in such a way to have efficient and thoughtful and interesting conversations. And that, I think, is the ultimate end result of this episode for me. Suicide is interesting. It's interesting to analyze. It's interesting to talk about. Independent of the individual experience, it is something that is valuable to think about in and of itself. And we learn about the act, we learn about our cultures, we learn about our friends and family, and we learn about ourselves by learning about suicide. And that makes the world philosophically richer, even as it guides us in our own behavior in terms of what we think is right and what we think is wrong. You have been listening to Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Thank you for listening. As always, it's an honor to be with you.
Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is a monthly radio show on Prairie Public Radio, part of the National Public Radio Network. Why Radio is a production of the University of North Dakota's Institute for Philosophy and Public Life. It's broadcast on the second Sunday of every month, and an extended version with more than 30 minutes of extra discussion is available for free as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast services. Please rate and review us and share us with your friends. Follow us on the usual social networks. Our handle is always @Y Radio Show. That's @WHY Radio Show. Instagram is our most active platform. Our free archive with close to 2 decades worth of episodes is available on our website, yradioshow.org. Visit to learn more about us, our sister show, Philosophical Currents, and IPPL's other projects. Please go to yradioshow.org to make your tax-deductible donation via UND's Alumni Association. Click on the blue donate button in the upper right-hand corner. Jack Russell Weinstein is our host. Teante Calloway is our engineer and editor. Why's music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Lua y Sol. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com. Why Radio is copyright Jack Russell Weinstein and funded as a partnership of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life and Prairie Public Broadcasting. IPPL is an academic unit of the University of North Dakota College of Arts and Sciences. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we have inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.